We're now on Daf Mem Tesam and Beis. Avol Klolo Gomer Mineh. Now, what we could do is we could derive from the case of Hasham Mitzor for all Hashamos, and then it's Shaper. Now, once you set up that general category of all Hashamos deriving Tzafon from Hasham Mitzora, even though it's a Dover Chadash, then you're fine. Because then when the Torah repeats the requirement of Tzafon in Karban Asham, it's coming to tell you that it's Li Kuva, that Shina Lava Kasu Liake. But Ella, if on the other hand, Isvirlan, we accept the other opinion. And what's the other opinion? Delohu gomer michlalo v'lo klolo gomer minei. That when you have this specific prat, and that prat has a dover chadash, then we don't put that back into the klal, and we don't derive conclusions from the case of a dover chadash. Is therefore highly itzrich, highly gufe itzrich. I can't rely on the requirement of tzafon as a specific application of the rule of all hashamos to the case of Hasham Mitzorah. That I can't do. Why? Because I need to know that there's a requirement of tzafon in this particular Asham Hasham Mitzorah, because Hasham Mitzorah is a Dover Chadash. And we might think that the strict requirements that apply normally to an Asham of Tzafon, meaning that the Shechita and the Kabbalah has to be with the Kohen standing in the Tzafon, they don't, we can waive them with regard to an Hasham Mitzorah, because Hasham Mitzorah, the entire function of the Karban is a different function at all. It's part of the process of Tara. The Torah could be makel on that. So now again, we're back to square one. We don't know that that Safon is li'ikuva. So Gemara says, Kevada Hadre Ahadre. And now the Gemara is saying that even if as a general rule, we don't derive generalities from a Dover Chadash, but here the Torah took Hasham Mitzorah and put it back into the category of general Hashamos. For what purpose? To lafuki, to undermine a possible thought and a conclusion that we would come to that maybe Hasham Mitzorah doesn't require Zrikas Adam al Gam Mizbech or Haktoras Emurim. However, once the Torah took Hasham Mitzorah and put it back, Ahadre means it returned the Hasham Mitzorah to the general membership of all Hashamos, requiring therefore Zrikas Adam al Gam Mizbech and Haktoras Emurim al Gabi Mizbeach. Now we take Hasham Mitzorah, we put it back into the general klal. So as we've already proven that despite the Dover Chodesh of an Hasham Mitzorah with regard to Matan Bahonos, but nevertheless, other than that, it's identical with any other karma requiring Zrikas Adam and Haktoras Emurim. So the Torah is basically putting replacing, I would say, Hasham Mitzorah back into the category of Hashamos. And just like we said in the category of Hashamos, we're going to equate that with Chatos and with Olah, and therefore derive the conclusion that Tzafon is Likuva. So too in the case of Hasham Mitzorah, Tzafon is Likuva. So at this point in the Shakavatari, everything fits into place. But the Gemara is still not happy with it. When do we apply the principle of ki ahadre ahadre? That's only. Okay, now the Gemara pulls a fast one. The Gemara wants to know if this whole Dover Chodesh of Matan Bahonos, of sprinkling the dam on his thumb and his big toe, and maybe that doesn't even require a kohen. Maybe it's not even an avoda, and therefore we need a chiddush to say that in Hasham Mitzorah we require a kohen, and that's the lashon of the Gemara here. Legabe matan damim ve'murim debari kahuna. Maybe what the Torah is saying is that we need a Kohen for Matan Domim because Matan Domim now since a hadre, we took Asham Mitzvah and put it back into the category of all the Ashamos. Now we say the following, just like in any Asham and any carbon for that matter, you need a Kohen to do the Avoda. So whenever you need the Kohen to do the Avoda, then you need the Kohen to do the Avoda even in an Asham Mitzvah. But the exception to the rule is Aval Shchita lo boy kahuna lo mi boy tzafon. It's very strange here because on the one hand, you want to put Asham Mitzvah back into the category of Ashamos. And therefore you want to derive the conclusion that the Shchita and the Kabbalah of an Asham Mitzvah requires tzafon. But you can't do that. That's not fair play. Because I need to a hadre to place Asham Mitzvah back into the category of requiring a Kohen for those avodos that are typical and essential for all Karbanos Asham. But I can't derive any conclusions about Shechita. We're trying to establish that Safon is a requirement in Shechita. Well, if you're talking about a hadre as far as Kohen is concerned, for the other avodos of Kabbalah and Holacha and Zrika, those are Kabbalas that require a Kohen in all cases of Ashama. So then a hadre is going to operate. But what gives you the right to apply a hadre and derive the conclusion that Safon is a requirement in Shechita? All the other requirements that you derive are requirements that critically, absolutely require a Kohen. But if you're talking about Shechita, which doesn't require a Kohen, and even a Zar could do the Shechita, then maybe we don't need Safon for the Shechita. We'll need Safon for the rest of the Avodos. And that will derive from a Hadre, but we cannot derive Safon in Shechita because there's no requirement of Kohen in Shechita. So Gemara says, no. Im Kain, if you're going to tell me that a hadre only operates with those avodos that require a Kohen, but not with Shechita, is then name a kra, ki kachatos hu. Why does it say the extra word ha'osham? It could have just said ki kachatos hu. It's like a chatos. And just like a chatos requires tzafon, so the Asham Mitzvah will require tzafon. But why did the Torah add another word, kechatas ha'asham? The extra word ha'asham is a ribui to tell you that the ahadre is keshar hashamos, that it puts Asham Mitzvah back into the general category of Asham, of all the Ashamos, even as far as Tzafon is concerned. Okay, now, since we're continuing with Rabbi Yishmael and the rules and regulations that apply to scriptural exegesis, now we're going to get into a discussion about Hekesh. And you may recall we had this discussion, I don't remember when, a few days ago, whether if you derive X from a Hekesh to Y, can you derive Z from a Hekesh to X? It's one Hekesh built on another. So the Gemara says, Lama li lakushe lechatos. Right? Why didn't you go straight to Ola? Why did you need a Hekesh between the Asham Mitzorah and Chatos? And Chatos itself is derived from a Hekesh through Ola. Lama li lakushe leola. Why did you then go ahead and compare it to Ola? So you had two different occasions. You took Asham Mitzorah, compared it, number one, to an Asham, to a Chatos, and number two, to an Ola. Why'd you need that? Totally superfluous. We need it. Why? If the Torah had only equated Asham Mitzorah to what? To a Chatos. Havamina Chatos mehechel lemedo me'ola. Davar lamed behekesh. Choser umelamed behekesh. Right? So if it would have just said what? Chatos and not Asham, we would come to the mistaken conclusion that Chatos is going to teach me about, what did I just say? Let me go over it again. If the Torah only equated Asham to Chatos and not to Ola, we would have come to the conclusion that Chatos is a very fine source through the mechanism of Hekesh to derive Tzafon in the case of an Asham Mitzorah. And that would lead us to a mistaken conclusion that Chatas could teach something about Osham when Chatas itself was derived from a Hekesh to Ola. And therefore, I would have come to the conclusion that Dover Lo Mehekesh Chozum Alami Behekesh, and that's not so. Amalei Marzutra Bereder of Mari Ravino V'Nikshe Li Ola V'Lo Nikshe Lechatas. Why couldn't the Torah simply tell me that the din and the requirements of Osham are equal to that of an Ola? Cut out Chatas. And that itself would have taught me that the reason why we have to circumvent Chatas and omit Chatas from the equation is because if we would derive it from Chatas, we'd be stuck with the fact that Chatas itself is a derivative from an analogy from a Hekesh. Ravina is not happy with this. Ravina says, Hav Hamina, Davra Lo Mehekesh Chozum Lam Lehekesh. V'yichitema nikshe ekshui lechatas, nichle demakish leile ikar, v'lo nakish leile tofel, l'hochi akshe lechatas, v'akshe leola. L'meimer dover she'alamid behekesh, eino chozum alamid behekesh. Says Ravina, that if the Torah had gone straight as the bird flies, a straight line from Asham Mitzorah to Ola, then Havamina. Havamina means I would have come to the mistaken conclusion that Davar Lami Behekesh Chozer Malami Behekesh. Right? Again, why not? Not that I have a proof to this conclusion, but I don't have a disproof, so therefore, mistama, I can assume. And then if you'll ask me, so why didn't the Torah equate Asham with, right? Asham means Asham Mitzvah, with Chatos, if Davar Lomi Behekesh Chozer Malami Behekesh, it's the answer I'm going to give you is that Nichle Demakish Leili Ikar, because it's more attractive and smooth for the Torah to derive Safon in Asham Mitzorah from the original meaning from Ola. Why derive it from something that in itself is derived? Maybe Chatos Ke'Osham, Chatos Ke'Ola, Chatos is derived from Ola. Rather than say, well, we're going to make a Hekesh to Chatos. Chatos itself is secondary, it's a derivative. And therefore, the Torah went ahead in order to teach me that Dover Alomi Behekesh Eino Chozer Malami Behekesh. The Torah therefore said, I'm going to spell it all out. I'm going to give you a Hekesh to Chatos, but don't come to the conclusion mistakenly that the Hekesh to Chatos is sufficient, because Chatos can't teach beings about Safon, because Chatos itself is a derivative from Ola. And therefore, I'm going to set up an equation between Asham and Ola. And this is going to teach me that Torah love and Hekesh Eino Chozer Malam Behekesh. So it's interesting that the Torah actually went out of its way to add a step here that's totally unnecessary in order to tell you that it's invalid. Do you follow? In other words, why did the Torah have to add Chatos? The answer is the Torah wanted to add Chatos to tell you that if we only had Chatos, you couldn't derive Asham from Chatos. And therefore the Torah spelled out Ola. Rav Amar Mehacha. Rav has an alternative possibility from which he wants to derive this rule that Davar Lavim Min HaHekesh Ein Chozer U'Malam Behekesh. To Chsiv it says, okay, now we're into Chatos of Kohen Gadol. Right? If the Kohen Gadol issued an erroneous ruling and violated an Isur Kares, and he has to bring a par. So that's called par shel Kohen Mashiach. And the pasuk says, where am I? Oh, Kasha Yuram Mishor Zevach Hashlomim Viktiram HaKohen Al Mizbach HaOlah. So this pasuk, I don't have the whole pasuk in front of me right now, but it's teaching me about Yoseres HaKoved, right? That there are certain parts of the para that need Haktorah al Gabi Mizbeach. So Yoseres HaKoved is the diaphragm, Koved is the liver, and the Kloyos are the kidneys. But now the Torah adds Kashayorum Mishar Zevach Hashlamim. I don't get it. Lemay Hilchsa. Why did you have to compare it to Zevach Hashlamim, to the power of Shlamim? Elios says Hakovish Te Kloyos, Begufek Siv. That's written in the pasuk itself. The Torah tells us that the power of Mashiach, of Kohen Mashiach, requires the Haktorah of Shtei Kloyos Yoseres HaKoved. Rav Papa mishum de boy like Muri Yoseres HaKoved Shtei Kloyos mipar helim dover shel tzibulis irei avodas kocham. Right, there's one hekesh that's built on another hekesh. So you have now a hekesh between a par helim dover and seirei avodas kocham when most of the community violated unintentionally idolatry. And Begufe lo ksiv, right? In the parsha of, as we discussed in the past, of Par Helim Del Shot, it doesn't mention anything about, the Aktorah of Shtei Kloyos and Yoseres HaKoved. Elo what? We're going to derive it from an equation, a hekesh to Par Kohen Mashiach of the Gomer. Is lahachi itzur kasha yuram heavy command the kosa begufe. So the kasha yuram in the mention of shlamim here, with regard to shtei akloyos and Yoseres HaKoved, is as if it was written explicitly in the parsha of just 1 second. Let me just I just want to make sure I don't make a mistake here. Just let me get a chumash here, just to make sure. Okay, he tells you it's Daled Ches. Let me just get it out here. Daled Ches. Just want to make sure I got this right. Yeah, this is the par of Kohen Mashiach. How do I know this? Because it says at the beginning of Perek Daled, Nefesh ki sechta, etc., etc. And then it says, V'im Kohen Mashiach yechta. And in that parsha, it says explicitly, V'yashtei hakloyos, etc., etc., Ves Yoseres HaKoved. So the Torah went out of its way to spell out, in the case of Kohen, Par Kohen Mashiach, that you require the Haktorah of Shtei Kloyos and Yoseres HaKoved. And then the Torah gets an equation, Kashayoram Mishar Zevach Hashlamim. So the question is, why did the Torah have to derive anything from Shlamim when it's explicit in the Parsha? And the answer is, Lahachi itzrich kasha yuram denehevi kiman de kosa v'gufe. So it's as if the kasha yuram takes the Yoseres HaKoved, etc., etc., into the parsha of Kohen Mashiach, and now it says it twice. Why did it say it twice? The answer is lo nehevi, so that we shouldn't derive it from davar lo behekesh choser malamin behekesh. that we can now derive it from par helim davar shel tzibur and sa'ir shel avodas kol chavim. Only Rav Papa Rava, Rav is not happy with Rava because he says lichtave begufe v'lo nakish. If the Torah wants to teach us that, why didn't it just teach me that you have to bring these things on the mizbeach? There'll be no need to go back and compare it to Parahel Davar Shel Tzibur. So Rava responds, "Ikasu begufe v'lo akish." If the Torah had just written this requirement of shtei klois, etc., in the Parahel Davar Shel Tzibur, without comparing it to the hekesh to the Kohen Mashiach, I would say Davar lo behekesh chozer v'lami behekesh. So now that we derived kloyos, etc., from in Parahel Davar Shel Tzibur from Kohen Mashiach, now the Parahel Davar Shel Tzibur could be your instrument to derive from a hekesh the general the application to. So he says, "V'chi tema nakish akushe." Why don't we do a double hekesh here of Parahel Davar Shel Tzibur with Kohen Mashiach, right? And then we can derive Sa'ir Shel Avodas Kol Chavim. So the answer is Nichole lekatve begufe, because it's a little bit more simple or comfortable for the Torah to write the requirement of these parts that have to be Niktar Gam Mizbeach in the parsha of Parahel Davar Shel Tzibur. Mida Akish le'akushe, and as opposed to set up a hekesh. Why set up a hekesh and go around the, to get there? Why not just say it explicitly? And now we're going to say that the Torah set up this hekesh, and we're going to come to the mistaken conclusion. Remember the davar alomi behekesh and chosum alam behekesh. Okay then. So now the Gemara says the following. We have about 5 minutes left, maybe. Let's see what we can accomplish here. Okay, now we have a mnemonic device. Anyway, davar alomi behekesh eino chosum malamed mehekesh. If we derive from Rava, Ravina, or you derive that conclusion from Avina, what about Davar Alami behekesh, Maushi Alami b'gzeira shava? If Y is derived from X with a hekesh, could Y now teach me something about Z with a gzeira shava? The Gemara vacillates back and forth about this question. Meaning maybe a gzeira shava is more powerful than a hekesh, and it could extend its arm even in the case of a hekesh, where had it not been a gzeira shava but a hekesh, it could not be derived. Toshma Reb Nosson ben Avtulmunus Omer Minayin lepricha b'begadim shitahora. Right, if let's say the tsaras now spreads throughout the beged, paradoxically, or shall we say, it's counterintuitive, but it becomes tar because it's spread throughout the entire beged. And how do we know this? We derive from Gzeira Shava. Nemar karachas v'gabachas v'begadim. Right, these are different types of nigei begadim. One is called kirachas, and the other is called gabachas. V'nemar kirachas v'gabachas v'adam. So also with regard to a person. Okay, this is an entire parsha in Vayikra Perek Yud Gimel. Okay, and now we have a Gzeira Shava between these two psukim, Malahala, just like there, in the case of Adam, is Parach Bekulo Tar, if this phenomenon of Karachas or Gabachas spread throughout his entire goof, that's called Nigei Guf, he becomes Tar. It's therefore, in the case of Begadim, Parach Bekulo Tar, it's Tar, even though counterintuitively, the affliction on the beged, which is called either kirachas or gabachas, spread throughout the entire beged. So that we're going to derive from Gzeira Shava. How do you know in the case of an Adam that he's afflicted with taras, that he becomes tar if this gavacha spreads throughout his entire goof? Dichsiv, because it says in the pasuk, Meirosho vi'ad raglav. Right. So what does the pasuk say? Im paroach tifrach atzaras bi or v'kisa atzaras is called or negabi rosho v'ad sofo. Then he's tar. V'yiskash rosho l'regel. Right. If let's say, not only did he have it on his head, he had it on his foot. Is malahal and kulo hafach leben lovan. Parach b'kulo tar. Is afkan kulo hafach leben lovan. Excuse me. Parach b'kulo tar. So now we use the hekesh from which we derive the halacha that parach applies to even the case of kerachas. Then we extend that law to the case of a beged that also had pricha, which means it spread throughout the garment. So you see that we started with a hekesh and we ended up with the Gzera Shava. The Gzera Shava was built on top of the hekesh. And the Gemara rejects it. Omer Rabbi Yochanan, B'chol HaTorah Kula Meidim Lamed Melamed Chutz Min HaKodshim Shein Donim Lamed Melamed. So Rabbi Yochanan formulates the following principle. We could derive a derivative from a derivative itself, with the exception of Kodshim. And Kodshim ain't Donim Lamed Melamed. So you'll bring a proof from the case of Tzaras. Tzaras is not a case of Kodshim, but rather it's a case of Tahara. Tim Kain lo yomer tzofona bi Oshem, v'teisev gzeres shava the kodshi kodshim ichatos. Lav lememer the dover alam behekish eino chozim alam b'gzeres shava. So Rabbi Yochanan has a proof that something that's derived from a hekesh can no longer teach me something through the mechanism, the vehicle of Gzera Shava in Kodshim, and all your other proofs from other areas outside the laws of Kodshim are not relevant to Kodshim. And the logic of Rabbi Yochanan with this will conclude is that the Torah didn't have to mention Safona in Asham. We could have derived it from Gzera Shava. And what is that Gzera Shava? Of Kodshe Kodshim from Chatos. Right, Sofon is a requirement in Chatos. And we have a Gzera Shava between Chatos and Asham. And therefore, why did the Torah have to specify Asham Sofon in Asham if we could derive it from the Gzera Shava of Chatos? Well, the answer is because Chatos itself is a hekesh to Ola. And therefore, you can't build the Gzera Shava between Asham and Chatos on top of the hekesh of Chatos to Asham, because Dover Olam hekesh and Achozim Olam Gzera Shava. So you know what? I know we're going over time. Just one more minute, so we finish the sugya. Vidilma mishum deikol mifrach malachat shkem b'chaperes al chayve krisus. Again, the Gemara is going back to that old logic that we cannot derive asham from chatos through this gzera shava because chatos is very profound, is very stringent. It has a power and therefore a higher level of requirement that it atones even for a kares. And the Gemara says that's not a valid argument because kodshe kodshim yisere ksive. He says here that with regard to chatos, the Torah says daber el Aaron and zos Torah chatos, and the Torah calls it very kadosh, most holy. And then it says that Asham is like Chatos. So there's an extraneous mention of most holy. Okay. It's a shame that in my Gemara it doesn't quote all the psukim. For that, I need the Masifta, but Zos Torah Sa'asham, Kodesh Kadoshim Hu, and then it says, B'mokum asher yishchtu sa'ol yishchtu sa'asham. So Kodesh Kadoshim Hu, so we're saying that Yisere Ksivi. So here, I guess you have to know more about the rules that govern Xeris Shava. But okay, so this has to do with Xeris Shava is when you compare two contexts, one to the other, and the question is, do you need mufna? Do you derive the two key words of the Xeris Shava? Each one is superfluous and unnecessary in its context. So the Gemara is saying that Kodesh Kadoshim here makes it, since it's extraneous and superfluous and unnecessary, therefore it becomes Xeris Shava that's mufna mishnei atzodim. And Xeris Shava that's mufna mishnei atzodim doesn't lend itself to any pircha. So therefore you were asking a pircha, well, maybe chatas is different because it's mechaper on a chiv kares. The answer is no. Once the Torah in Asham says Kodesh Kadoshim, and then we have Xeris Shava to chatos, then you can't reject that Xeris Shava through the normal mechanism of pircha, because that Xeris Shava is mufna mishnei atzdod. Okay, this is where we'll stop. So I wish you a great day. Thank you so much.